Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Jessica Lounsbury with the Office of Alumni Engagement here at McMaster. This evening's webinar is the next in our exploration series of events taking place during the month of November. This is part one of a special two-part series in partnership with the Hamilton author Gary Barwin and the Hamilton Philharmonic Orchestra. This evening webinar features an interview between award-winning author Gary Barwin and HPO's composer-in-residence Abigail Richardson Schulte as they explore the making of the literary series, a powerful program that explores beautiful ways in which literature and music connect to share a story, and life as an author and historian. Part two of this series will take place this time next week, where Gary Barwin and HPO musicians will present a captivating performance that combines words and music. Next week's event features Barwin reading from his novel Yiddish for Pirates and the music by the HPO String Quartet. We hope you'll join us for that session as well. It is now my pleasure to introduce Gary Barwin and Abigail Richardson Schulte. Gary is the author of 26 books, including Nothing the Same, Everything Haunted, The Ballad of Model the Cowboy, which won the Canadian Jewish Literary Award, and Bird Arsonist with Tom Prime. His national best-selling novel, Yiddish for Pirates, won the Leacock Medal for Humor and the Canadian Jewish Literary Award, was a finalist for the Governor General's Award for Fiction and the Scotiabank Giller Prize, and was longlisted for Canada Reads. Abigail Richardson Schulte is currently composer in residence with the Hamilton Philharmonic Orchestra, serves as artistic director of the HPO's What's Next Festival, hosts community events, and teaches compositions for University of Toronto. Her music has been commissioned and performed by major orchestras, presenters, musical festivals, and broadcasters. In this interview, Abigail and Gary will explore the making of the literary series, as well as life as an author and historian. If you have any questions for our panelists this evening, please type them in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will have time to answer a few at the end of the formal part of the webinar. Over to you, Abigail and Gary.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, Gary, it's a delight to speak with you, and I'm so pleased that we're able to set the stage for the literary series concert next week. So many people know you, of course, as an author. You have so many accolades, and do they know you as a composer, though? So perhaps you can give us a little bit of an idea about your musical background.
Sure. I don't know if I don't know what people know, and I feel I should take the time to deny most of those rumors. But actually, my formal academic training was in music. I did a PhD in music composition. So and that was really that has always been a big part of my work, and I'm constantly writing music, and I do a lot of music that involves text, and music that involves visuals. So I'm also when I write whatever I write, I often put music to it. I often put visuals to it. I make videos and do multimedia. It's sort of, it feels like just a part of my completely part of my practice. And I play saxophone, so I play in some free improvisation ensembles and some jazz things and some classical things. I've always I did art and music and writing since I was a kid, and I just never stopped. To me, I think we make a difference, but we make a distinction between those things, and I don't know that there's as much of a difference. I mean, obviously you use different materials, but I feel like I come to writing music or writing text in the same way. It's about rhythm and form and association, and what you can evoke in the listener, and patterning and kind of sensory pleasure, regardless of which sense it is. It feels like it's very much the same to me.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, music can be storytelling even if there's no story, right? I mean, it can happen entirely just through musical means.
Right, and I would say that a lot of particularly poetry often is like music in the sense it has a flow that's sort of narrative, or that moves through time and kind of conceptual space, but it doesn't actually tell a story or meaning. It's more like music, maybe.
And you know, it was really great for me. I'm reading Yiddish for Pirates right now, and it's really great for me to hear you reading it and hear the natural rhythm you put into your reading. So that's something that that people can watch for and listen for next week.
Well, thank you, because you know, to me, the book is a lot about oral tradition. So we were talking about things that are not storytelling, but so it really is exploring storytelling. I mean, in the very beginning, like a lot of nautical tales, it's like, come gather round while I tell you a tale. It literally has that in it. And so I'm so interested in how people tell stories, how they, the kind of style and musicality they tell, and how it's spoken, right? We are always kind of telling stories about ourselves, about our past, about our tradition, about language, and how we do that. It's both seductive because we can't help but being drawn into the story, but at the same time, it's like, wait a second, am I being drawn into the story, or am I being deceived? Is you know, by seduced by the beautiful sound of, or that, you know, I mean, by the compelling nature of it? Is, wait a second, but is that actually true? That is something that really interests me, and it's and part of that is the performance, as one performs it, and that also, that like a politician performs what they say, and that helps you believe it. But also it entertains you, it inspires you, it engages you in many ways.
And you know, I think your performance, your reading, I could see that it is drawn from probably experience as a music performer. I think there's a great deal of performance in how you read your text. To me, it's almost on the edge sometimes of slam poetry in a way.
But I also think but there's so many kinds of performative speech, like whether if you go to a church and there's a preacher preaching, if you go to an auction, or you go to somebody who's like, there's all these things, or somebody telling a story or a joke, or there's so many ways that we use language that leap out beyond the kind of staid quiet way it unfolds in, we might imagine it unfolds in well-shaped fiction. It's all very well behaved, and there's so much that's not about that, which is one of the things I loved about at least literary pirates, that their delight in language, and they're really over the top, and they delight in the sound of their own expressions and the sound of their voices, and that kind of piratey, I be this, and like all of the stuff that we imagine. I mean, whether or not that's actually any of that is true, it doesn't matter. It's so delightful. And also then, so Yiddish for Pirates has a lot of Yiddish in it, because it's also part of people who speak Yiddish also frequently take delight in the language and kind of pleasure in the telling and in the pacing of it, and telling stories and jokes and anecdotes and sayings. So that was really interesting. And that, in a way, maybe that is musical. I think of there's musicians who talk about the other way around. They're telling a story through their instrument. And so I feel that's why I feel it really relates. And then maybe later we can talk about what stories carry in terms of identity, tradition, emotion, history, like music does, like the song that people have songs that say something about them and say something about where they've come from and the people they've come from.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in this concert that we're going to watch, we really go back and forth between you telling the story, yeah, and then sort of fleshing it out in music, if you will. So I think you're a perfect person who can program a concert like this, being able to draw from the repertoire, and also even write some pieces for it. So can you tell us about the music that will be played by the string quartet?
Yes, it was a really fun thing to do. It's kind of like having a story and thinking about, okay, what illustrations will go? But it's like, okay, so what is the music? What is the soundtrack to this? So so the story I'll quickly tell you the story. So then I'll tell you how I picked the music that goes with that. Great. So basically it takes place, there's a parrot. Okay. Even before that, it begins with there's a young boy goes to his grandfather's room at an old age home, and wanting to have the grandfather tell him the story of his life. He's a bar mitzvah boy. He wants to find out, as many bar mitzvah boys do, they find out the story of their family. They go find a grandfather or a grandmother and say, what's our story? The grandfather's asleep, but he has a parrot. The parrot says, okay, he's asleep. Never mind. I will tell you the story. Whereupon he tells this whole story about the parrot being a pirate's parrot. 500 years before, he tells the story of this young boy, Moshe, who comes from Eastern Europe. He's an Ashkenazi Jew from Eastern Europe. He wants to seek the wide world. He gets on a boat. He ends up in England, and then finally he's on a boat, and he finally ends up in Spain around 1492. So what's happening then? The Inquisition, where Jews and then very shortly later Muslims are expelled from Spain. They either can convert, become Christian, or they are expelled, and they're left with nothing. They can just leave with whatever they can carry. Of course, 1492 is also another famous date. It's when Columbus also left. So our protagonist, Moshe, leaves with Columbus to go exploring, to go to see what they can find, and they bump into the Caribbean. Whereupon eventually Moshe becomes a pirate. He wants to get back at the Spanish who kicked the Jews out, and he's pirates around for a bit. He also decides to seek there's a mystery involving books, which is the treasure. He also ends up looking for the Fountain of Youth, which supposedly they thought was in Florida, which I thought was really, really funny, considering Florida being a place for like retirees.
Yeah.
And supposedly in St. Augustine, Florida, that's where they thought it actually, literally, they thought it was. So that's sort of basically the story. So I have a number of cultural and I have a number of cultural identities in a number of places. So I had some Jewish music. I play on saxophone. I play some improvise around a Jewish melody. I also wrote a piece which uses a Jewish melody, an Eastern European Jewish melody that reflects Moshe's Eastern European background. The string quartet plays some Defaya, Spanish dance. It's for representing Spain. There's a really nice piece by it's an American composer, William Grant Still, which is it's called From Dances de Panama. So it's from the Americas to represent the Caribbean. He's actually an interesting composer because he was it was from the Harlem Renaissance, a very early Black American classical composer, really a fantastic composer. And then I wrote in a piece that was, I guess, vaguely piratey and hornpipey, sort of dancey. We have these ideas of pirates on the deck of a ship dancing around. They actually did dance, partially just to pass the time, to practice coordinating movements, to like sailors did that. And in fact, they would hire a musician to be on as part, like boats they have various people to do various things, including a musician was on the, you get a gig wherever you can, you know, bar mitzvahs, weddings, pirate ships, you know, whatever it is. So, but that is actually true. So,
so is that your shoulder dance?
Yes.
Okay. And is it called shoulder dance because Aaron the parrot is on Moshe's shoulder all the time? I guess so.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. So all the time he talks about, he calls Moshe, parrots bond with people, and pirates. So I imagine pirates bond with their pirate. So that's his shoulder, because he sits on his shoulder the whole time. And when I was writing the book, I was thinking, okay, who am I going to get to narrate this? And then it occurred to me that in pirate land, you have a parrot, and so the parrot is always there. So he's like a GoPro camera, kind of watching what's going on. And he's also a bit like a Greek chorus of one, because he's commenting on what's happening.
And he's hilarious.
Yeah, no, thank you. I gave full rein to him being this sort of like cantankerous old Jewish man, basically, which I did research. I did field research. I met some parrots. And African gray parrots, which Aaron, my parrot, is, they're really cantankerous. They're in heat for 6 months of the year. So they're really horny all the time.
And people can tune in for an example of that.
Well, in fact, there is
Yeah,
actual Yiddish parrot on parrot sex scene that I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it was really interesting that, I mean, they really have strong personalities, and they really did seem, they would be great, this cantankerous, horny, opinionated, but loving creature that real parrots are, that I made in my narrator. And the other thing about parrots actually is, of course, they can learn to speak human languages. So I found that really fascinating. And they use them in real life, they use them in context. So I went to visit a friend of mine who had a parrot, and when I zipped up my bag to go, and he goes, goodbye, goodbye. Like, the parrot knows what you're doing and uses language that's appropriate. But the other thing about a parrot that I loved is parrots have their own parrot imagination, but they speak to us only given the language that they know. Like, we give them English, say we're English, we give them English. And from that, they have to put together a way of expressing their experience and communicating, which of course is what we all do, whether we are musicians or just speakers. We only have as much language as we have, and we somehow have to put the elements together. Like, we've got a limited amount of language, and we put it together to express ourselves. And somehow that represents, or mostly represents, our experience of the world. And then actually we put stories together too, right? We have like sort of certain tropes, certain ideas about how the world works that we kind of mix and match them to try and understand and communicate our language, which is what the parrot does. He learns the language from Moshe. In this case, he learns Yiddish. And so I have this parrot from Africa. He's an African gray, speaking like this old Jewish man, because he's learned the language that Moshe has taught him.
Right. Now, I think when people watch this concert, they will see the influence of the story in the music you wrote. But do you ever find that your musical background will influence the words you write?
I think so. Like I was saying before, to me, I mean, writing is about, is very much about the flow of the language, which includes rhythm and kind of the pacing of information and kind of images or motifs that come back, or that flow along in a sentence or a paragraph or a whole book, which feels to me very much like what happens when one makes music, whether when you're improvising or composing, you're going with, there's sound over sense, but of course there's sense in this, in the sense that it has to make sense. It has to, and somehow, it relates organically to what's come before it. And with all the anticipations and suspense and surprises that happen in music or happen in writing.
Have you ever used musical subjects in your writing? I mean, musical subjects are somewhat popular with writers, and sometimes they don't know the music side and it becomes a little bit obvious, but you could actually do it.
Yeah, I have. One thing that I did, in fact, my PhD was a piece where, and I've done a bunch of pieces like that, where this is a different kind of thing, and where I notated the rhythms of normal speech, and then I've used exactly those rhythms for the instrumental parts, so that I could really sync it up, so that syllable by syllable, and that I could really have control. But I have done thematically. I have a short story called The Saxophonist Book of the Dead, which is about jazz saxophonists. And so what I would say is that my writing often is permeated by references to music. It just, that when I reach for a metaphor, it seems natural to think about music. And I would also say that I guess I'm interested in the body, and how we experience the world and the kind of the rhythm of being. And that seems like music to me, right? To thinking, because we experience music, and two notes feel like they have a relationship to how a body might move or not, or theoretically moves. We feel the kind of, even if it's very abstract and very very complicated rhythms that you couldn't actually dance simply to, but it feels like it's bodily. So that in that sense, I am always thinking about music in my writing.
Yeah, it's interesting. You seem to work in many different art forms, sort of simultaneously. That's what it seems to me in a way.
Yeah, no, and I mean a lot of the pieces I do, as I said, use all of the art for, because it's like, well, why do we get to a border? Why can't I just like cross it and add the other dimension to it so that artworks can be can employ everything, right? I mean, I think there's something lovely about it. Restrict only doing one, very minimalist, and somehow the less can be more, right? Just the fact, one solo instrument playing solo notes can feel, because we fill in everything in a way, it can feel like everything, but at the same time, the impulse to try and, explore that kind of dimensionality that multi-arts can give. It's not that I want to be Wagner or anything, but I understand the impulse to want to incorporate all of the senses and all of the ways of, the ways of experiencing the world and thinking of the world.
And in the spirit of exploration, there is a lot of exploration in Yiddish for pirates. You have history and time and language and travel and culture and language. There's just so much. And I'd like to talk about all of it if we can.
Yeah.
But first of all, tell us about your cultural background.
Sure. What did Stockhausen say? He was from Sirius? No, where is he from? He said he would say, which I forget which planet he said he was from.
I don't know.
He always says, but I'm not. So, but actually the book really is about, it really comes a lot from that. And my novels, in fact, really do come from thinking about, well, here I am, I'm talking to you, I'm in Hamilton, Ontario in 2022. And like, how is it that I got here? And how is it that I'm speaking English? Like that amazes me, right? Like, out of all the places in the world and out of all the ways of communicating, this is where I'm at. So my family, like Moshe, my protagonist, my grandparents all came from Lithuania. Luckily, they escaped before the Holocaust. Most of the rest of the family were killed. But my grandparents moved to South Africa. A lot of Jews from Lithuania, they call them Litvaks, moved to South Africa. It was a place that was open. It was kind of, there was gold and diamonds, and the country was opening up for immigrants. And so a lot of Jews moved there. There was lots of opportunity. So my grandparents moved there. And just as my grandparents left for their lives because of persecution, my parents left South Africa. It was apartheid when they grew up in apartheid, and they didn't want to have any part of that. So they moved. My dad wanted to go to medical school. They went to Britain, and he ended up, for one reason or other, in Northern Ireland to go to school there. That didn't turn out so well because it was the 60s and early 70s, so, because of the Troubles. And so that was another religious civil war, persecutions or unrest. So then we moved to Canada. So, I mean, I guess thinking about, again, why is it that I'm here? Why is it that I speak English? If history had been different, I would have spoken Lithuanian, Russian, Yiddish. Like, certainly I would have spoken Yiddish. My grandparents grew up speaking Yiddish as their first language, Yiddish and Russian. So
do you speak some Yiddish though?
You know what, like a lot of Jews, I speak a little bit of Yiddish, and I have a lot of feeling about it. I like it because it feels like my cultural inheritance. And there are certainly, I have lots of words and phrases and things that of Yiddish that I grew up with, that I hear my father-in-law's, it was his first language. So I hear him telling stories and almost a Yiddish style of telling stories. Like, I mean, it's easy to parody it, but like, so let me tell you, there was this guy, he was coming, like that kind of Hollywood sort of version of it. But there really is that oral tradition that is very much there. And so I know some of it. I did lots and lots of research in learning about Yiddish, and I consulted some experts in Yiddish, and that was, it's really interesting in itself, because as part of it is, the way many indigenous people talk about reclaiming their language. And I was kind of thinking about, well, my language and is Yiddish, and I wanted could have been Yiddish, and I wanted the kind of a worldview, like a kind of, as I said, a way of being in the world, which is kind of a Yiddish way of being in the world. It's a way of telling stories. It's a way of responding. There's a kind of a bitter joy about it, or a joyous bitterness about Yiddish. And there's a great phrase that I quote in the book. It's an old Yiddish saying that says, the tongue is not in exile. So you might leave a place without anything. All you have is your language, which means your stories, the words, the sayings, the intonations, and that also means the way you say it, which includes your body, as like, so I do a lot of, the language brings with it lots of culture, and so I wanted to have the actual Yiddish in it. So I have, all the way through the book, there's lots of actual Yiddish in it, and Yiddish jokes and little sayings and all of that, because it felt like if I was going to communicate the worldview, that's what you need that language. That's what, that's where it comes from. Mm-hmm. There's a book that I read by Junot Diaz, the American Dominican writer, called The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. It's a really fantastic book. And it's filled with lots of Dominican Spanish, which I don't speak. And so part of the delight is you hear the sounds of the culture. I'm not a Spanish speaker, so and especially the Dominican Spanish. So I had that kind of sound, when you're somewhere and you listen in on another language, and it's for the people speaking the language. It's not for me. So I get to like listen in. So there's a sense of who's it for and who's it not for. And it's like getting to taste some other culture's food. You get to be part of that. You don't know what it is, but you can appreciate that. So that's what I wanted to do. In my case, I didn't leave the language opaque. Every sentence that I use a word, I put the English word in somewhere in the sentence, unless you can get it from context, so that you end up becoming a bit of a Yiddish speaker as a reader too, oneself.
Yeah. I mean, I wondered if there would be a barrier because, approaching this book for me, because I don't speak Yiddish, but I found that knowing a reasonable amount of German, I could actually sound out the words, and it was, the same meaning in German, but not always the same meaning, right? Yeah.
So, I mean, and Yiddish has taken over lots of language from where the Jews were in Europe. Mostly German, but there's Polish, there's Hebrew, there's bits of Russian, there's just sort of it as Jews moved around the world, and Yiddish became an international language for Jews. It borrowed, there's Jews that moved to South America, lots in Argentina. So there are words from there that came in, and it's this whole stew of words. It's written in Hebrew script. Traditionally, I use the English Roman letters, but it's so in a way it's a carrier of the culture. Every place Jews went, they borrowed some language, they borrowed some sayings. So I love that, and it's very colorful. I would say Yiddish Yiddish was used for high culture as well. It became that, especially in the early 20th century. So there are great writers. Isaac Bashev, the singer, won the Nobel Prize writing in Yiddish. And so there's lots of philosophy and poets and works of scholarship. But I think the Yiddish that I use, and again, it's for pirates, so it's what they would know. There's the Yiddish that's full of the schmuck and the schmo and the schlemiel and the meshuggah and the verkakt and all these kinds of, which are kind of the ruder and more kind of colorful.
And it's funny too.
Yeah, and I think, and people who, it is, and it sort of feels, and Yiddish likes, for that kind of language, it really likes body and bodily terms. That's some part of the delight. There was a woman came up to me after I did a reading, an older Jewish woman, and she goes, so there's so much, like, everything is shtup here and shtup there, like so much shtupping. I don't, what do you do? Shtup, like, what's all this? I don't like it. It was offensive. But I bought the book because my husband, he likes shtupping, which I thought was hilarious. But I had these great discussions, because I was speaking their language, right? I mean, I was using that. And I think, like, some cultures delight in the juiciness of the language. Like if you hear someone from Newfoundland, they love the language, the way Newfoundland English is, and the expressions. And so Yiddish is like that. And there's lots of other places that do that. They take it like self-conscious delight in the humor and the mouthfeel of the language. And so I wanted to have lots of that in there. And I think also pirates in our literary pirate kind of Long John Silver kind of way also take delight in the language, in like really great insults and over the top expressions.
Yep. Bring it to life with a lot of color, but certainly works. It's great. Now, how much exploration did you need to do into your own culture for this in terms of research?
I did tons and tons of research, actually. I knew a bit about the Inquisition, but I didn't know a lot. So, though the book is like fanciful and told by a 500-year-old gay, immortal Yiddish-speaking parrot, there's lots of actual history that is quite amazing to find out. So I did lots of research into Spain at the time, the place of Jews, what Spain was like. There's some the scenes that take place in the big cathedral in Seville, and so it's actually amazing what's available. I kind of could do a virtual fly through of the cathedral, that somebody had made a simulation, so I could actually really see what was happening. And there were lots of like really remarkable stories that I learned that happened around the time. And even like I could find somebody had done a thesis, and there was the name of every crew member on Columbus's ship, and every barrel, like the entire contents of the ship. There's like all these different barrels and all these different, and I did change the name. Everybody was named Juan something, so I changed it to make it simple for the purposes of the book. But I could find like all these details, and as well as all these stories. The other thing I did though was, so there's lots of stories that are of the time that are and I based many characters on those actual historical figures. There's a woman who helps the Jews escape, Doña Gracia, who helps the Jews escape in my book. And she's based on a real historical figure who actually did that. There was a woman whose husband owned a shipping company, and he died, and then so she took over, because women weren't on their own otherwise allowed to do that. But so what she did was, she would take Jews, would sail to go to Morocco, and then she would come back with goods, and then she'd have another shipload of Jews going to Morocco and back. And so she helped people escape. And writing a pirate story, I also was really concerned to make sure to represent women, or make sure not notice when there were women, because the stories don't always include them. I should say, like, it wasn't like, oh, I better make up some. There were them. They were there, but just some of the stories don't represent them. And so I wanted to make sure to find that. The other thing I did was, there were a couple stories that came from other times that I mapped onto the time. So there was this amazing story that I was a friend of my parents, this guy who had escaped the Holocaust in Hungary. And he told me this amazing story, and I thought, okay, that has to go in a book. And this is the story. So it was about the guy who helped this friend of my parents escape from the Holocaust. And the guy, he was like a kind of a fixer, would get people and get them to escape. So he said, the difference between a prisoner and not a prisoner is if you're shaven, like if you're unkempt or not. So he said, I always keep razor blades in my lapels in case I'm ever arrested, because if I get arrested, brought in by the Nazis, I'm going to be able to I'll be able to shave and look really clean, and also not Jewish, and I'll be able to better to escape. So eventually he got arrested. He got taken in by the Nazis. He shaved him up so he didn't look like the other prisoners. Then there was a translator, a Nazi translator there, a Nazi official, and said, "Where's the translator?" And the guy stepped forward and said, "I'm the translator."
Oh, wow.
I said, "I can't wait to help the Führer and get those Jews." And so he translated for the guy. And then he said at some point, "Oh yeah, and by the way, could I get a ride downtown after work?" And so the guy said, "Well, I can't give you a ride. The Nazis said that, but my boss, Rudolf Eichmann, is going downtown, so you could get a ride with him. So this guy, this Jewish guy, escaped from the Nazis by getting a ride in Eichmann's limousine. So
That's unbelievable.
Like that's an amazing story. So I have kind of a related story that happens, except it's not Eichmann, it's Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor. And so my guy escapes, gets a ride essentially with Torquemada to escape, because like that's too great a story not to put in a book. And it's also that the book is thinking about persecution and about Jews were exiled and persecuted through the Inquisition. So I wanted to include, so to make a kind of connection in any case between other persecutions is important. I should just say one other thing. I know I'm doing more than answering the question, but one of the things I thought about was there were Jews in South Africa who were really racist. And I thought, well, you came from Eastern Europe where you escaped with your life because of persecution. And then you go to South Africa and then you're racist. Like, don't you make the connection between persecuting groups of people? And so I was thinking in this book about what was the role of, when you're the other, you're a Jew in Spain, you've been exiled, when you encounter somebody even with less status than you, a more other than you, like indigenous people in this case, what is your moral responsibility? Obviously, your responsibility is to help and to feel, to understand somewhat that experience, and certainly not participate in, racism and putting them down. And so that was part of the negotiation that I wanted my Jews to deal with in the story.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And when I was reading this, I know that it is inspired by historical events.
Yeah.
And I often wonder, there's a fine line between history and fiction, and
Yes.
how you negotiate that, really.
Yes. Well, thinking back to my family history, I remember I went to ask my grandmother stories about my family when it was my bar mitzvah. My grandmother told me all these stories about our family crossing Russia barefoot and all this. And then I talked to my parents, he goes, none of that was true. Like, she made it all up. But then I thought about it. And so it was, first of all, she couldn't help telling great stories. Like, they were amazing stories. But it was also something about, she wanted to express like the bigness and excitement of the world and the epicness of how she felt the world was, and even of what it was to have ended up where she was. So she was trying to kind of clothe the feeling with a story that was big enough, which writers do. And my Aaron is a teller of tall tales. So what is true that he says? What isn't true? What's an exaggeration? He is trying to, like I said before, putting stories together to somehow represent how he feels, even if the stories aren't literally true. They're about how he feels. And in fact, in the book, he borrows all sorts of stories from other writers to tell the story. There's bits of Dostoevsky. There's a bit of what's it called? Treasure Island. There's all these things that it's like, wait a second, he's telling the story, but it's from somewhere else. Is that true? Is it? But so maybe it's true. Maybe that's just language he's using. Maybe. So I mean, to me, that's the thing about what is true, what isn't true, why is it not true, in what way is it true in another way than the literal truth, what way are things misremembered, in what way are we seduced by not true things, what way do we not care because the story is really great.
Okay,
like,
so you're happy to have the reader not really know where we are in these barriers in this case, between truth and fiction.
Yeah, and also if anybody ever questions, it wasn't me, it was a parrot. It's filled with real research and real stories that I made. Some of them I moved to a different place. I moved the year. I did things like that. There's a scene where there's a priest praying. He's in front of the altar in the church, and he's praying, and somebody spears him with a spear. Kills him as and he gets impaled to the altar. That actually is something that actually happened. It didn't happen where I said it happened, but it did happen. So I said, that is a great story. I'm now going to put it, and whether my parrot, maybe he's just embellishing because he can't help, it's like it's pirate stories are like fish, like I caught a fish, it was this big. And in fact, when I did the research, I read lots of pirate books, like books, the famous books about pirates back hundreds of years, stories that were true or supposedly true. And a lot of the stories borrow from each other. There's all these, so it's like all of these things, you don't know if where did it come from? Is it true? Did everybody do that? Did they borrow a good story and make it about them? There's a story about Blackbeard, who supposedly he would, and I have it happening to my pirate. He would put fuses in his hair, in his beard, so that he'd come onto ship and his beard is like fuming and there's flames. So he looked terrifying because he looked like this like devil coming, this big pirate guy coming, and his beard and hair are on fire. Really scary. So that happened. So I made my pirate do that. Maybe he did do that. Maybe my narrator borrowed from it. Who knows, right? But I think, and that's part of it, is what is true and what is a wild, tall tale.
Okay, so there's lots of exploration through time, but also through locations. You have so much travel in this book. Was that part of your strategy in storytelling?
Well, I guess in this case, because it is a like a pirate story, those kind of stories at sea are about going somewhere. I mean, they're also going to different places, and what's brought with it. If he comes, both my parrot and my protagonist Moisha, they've come from other places, and so how does their way of being, their language, their understanding of the world, how does it change as they find themselves in England, in Spain, in the Caribbean? So there's that. And also it was a time when the world was opening up, and like where people were connecting with other people. So indigenous people had Europeans show up, and so they made, there was that first meeting of those people. So all of a sudden the world for both groups of people became larger than they realized. So that, and that's kind of, so that's exploration in the world. And then what is it to meet different people, right?
Yeah, I can see how exploration of culture is a big part.
My sound went off. It just, sorry, I missed. Yeah.
That's okay. Now, tell us how this novel itself was exploration for you.
Yeah, well, I'd written many books before this, like 20 something books, but I'd never written a novel. So I had been a music teacher actually in middle school. I taught at Hillfield, Strathallan, and then I left that position, and though I had been writing all the time, I wanted to work on a big project. So, and to I was like 50 or something. And so I wanted to try something different. And so I gave up my day job and so, like, I'm going to be a novelist. I remember running into some students and they said, what, Dr. Barwin, what have you, what were you doing this morning? Oh, well, I was in this coffee shop. I was working on my novel. And they go like, how cliche. I've got these 12-year-olds telling me how cliche, but it's like, okay, but how great, right? Like, yeah. And so I'd never written a novel. I didn't know how novels, like I'd read lots of novels, but I'd never written one. So I'd written a short young adult novel. And so that was an exploration about like reinventing who I am as a writer. And one thing that I found that was really tremendous was, so novels are long. They have a lot of words in them. They take a long time. And so the thing is, you start something and then you have to constantly reinvent yourself as a writer, because you can't use your, like after, 50 pages, I'd run out of my normal shtick. I had to sort of reinvent techniques or other ways, and I had to be responsible for what had happened. And so it kept kind of opening up more and more, kind of like literally an exploration, like as if I was on a quest. The novel kind of takes a quest form, but writing it was like that, because I had to every day go back to working on it and keep going, right? And find out what I would find the next day, because I didn't plan it. I had some vague idea of what was going to happen. I knew there was going to be treasure. I knew a number of things, but I didn't know what was going to happen. So that was an exploration in the content, but also what is it like to write 80,000 words? And so it was, I was so delighted that I found like depths of resources in me that I didn't think that I had, that I didn't know were there, because I had to drag them out kicking and screaming from my creative self, because I had to go deeper than what was easy for me. And so I found that kind of a profound experience that in my 50s to do that, and I loved that.
And it's quite a leap and a life change to leave a steady job like teaching and to become a writer slash artist.
Oh no, absolutely, it is absolutely. So I'm very appreciative. My wife's a lawyer, has a day job. So as my son would
Makes it
say,
easier.
so as my son, when I was freelance before I was a teacher, my son would say, "Mommy makes the paper money and Daddy makes the change." Thank you, son.
Oh, ouch.
But it's okay because it's all worked out because he's a musician now. So that's okay. We can have that talk back to him. But it was really a life change to jump into that. And so now, I mean, I do, I'm basically I do lots of freelance things. I sometimes I'm like I was at McMaster. I was writer in residence. I've done that in a whole bunch of institutions. I'm writing many different kinds of things. I'm doing music. I'm doing some mentoring, some editing, some like a whole bunch of, as one does, as you well know, you piece together all sorts of like cool things that are adjacent maybe to the main thing that you do, but that are also really that are inspiring and exciting, and you meet other people and have other experiences, which all feed into the work anyway.
Yeah, so really being part of the scene and generates work for you and interesting projects as well. I assume just like being a composer.
Oh no, absolutely. You know, and I did a thing. I was writer in residence at Western quite a while ago, and I ended up there was a young undergrad, and he was really talented, but kind of raw in his writing. And I met with him every week. He showed up, and and then some way a few years after that, we ended up writing a book together. And we've just written this summer. We finished the second book that we wrote, like a book of poems. We worked together. So it's like that. And from it's like the student has become the teacher, but I mean, it really was that. Like he's really precociously, like really a smart, interesting, divergent thinker. And I learned so much from working with him. In the beginning, it was definitely me being the teacher, like, you know, showing him the ropes, getting him going, helping him. But then he very quickly, you know, has become a peer. And so we work together, and it's so expanding for me as a writer.
And how is it being a writer in Hamilton?
It is, well, John Cage, somebody asked him, what's it like, this quote, they asked him, so how is it you're able to be a composer far away from the centers of culture in Europe? And he said, how is it you're able to be a composer so far away from the cultures of Europe? He says, how is it you're able to be a composer so close to the center of culture in Europe? So kind of like Toronto. Hamilton's great. I have, there's lots of really good writers here. There's an opportunity to get involved in lots of things. I work with, because it's a smaller city, I have opportunities to meet and to work with musicians, artists, other writers in ways that, say, in Toronto that I wouldn't, because like I got to work with the HPO, like that was awesome. The Toronto Symphony's not knocking on my door. And so I get this amazing opportunity that, to work with amazing people. Because the city's a bit smaller and people know each other in the arts and in academia. So it's been really great. And I never planned to move here. We moved here 32 years ago. We joke, my wife, criminal lawyer, we moved here because it was the only place she could find a job as a criminal lawyer. So we moved here for the crime, is why we say we moved to Hamilton. But it's been a really tremendous place. We raised our kids here, and so it's full of nature and full of other artists, right?
Yeah,
and opportunities. So I've been really finding it a great place.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Now, for those of you watching, we're happy to take some questions if you'd like to add them in the chat. But until that happens, I'll just keep asking you a few more questions, Gary. So you mentioned that you have been writer in residence. Oh, what does that involve?
It's a really great thing that a variety of places have: universities, libraries, some community colleges, some like a variety of places, a variety of institutions. So, I mean, it usually is divided between part of your time is to actually just write some project, and the other part is to mentor people, so people bring their work to you, or they want advice about writing, or they want to talk about writing, or so that's part of it. So at McMaster, the McMaster Writer in Residence, it was divided between McMaster and the public library. So people would come to either place with work they wanted me to look at, to read, to comment, with ideas about writing they wanted to discuss, with questions about being a writer. So that's part of it. And the other part is to put on some kind of, to work with the community. So I'm either giving workshops or giving talks or readings or facilitating events, which is really great. It's a really nice way. Hamilton, I guess I already knew quite well, but I got to know McMaster a lot better, even though I live in Westdale. I live right close to McMaster, but I didn't really know what went on in that mysterious place. And so now I had the opportunity. I met lots of students and staff and faculty and got to really be involved in that. And so that they bring things to me and I bring things to them in terms of the community. So we could, talk about things. I went to the archives and learned about the Mac archives and the amazing things, the amazing books that they have there. And I'm going to want to, do some projects there, for example. So it's a really nice way for writers to get to know a community and to work with the people in the community. So I've certainly, the other places I've been, I've learned about those cities that in ways I didn't know. It's an amazing thing how many people write and how many people want to talk to a writer and value stories and writing. And so I get to talk to them about that. It's really kind of a real honor, kind of marvelous.
Yeah, it sounds similar to being a composer in residence.
Yeah.
I've been with the HPO for 10 years. And, part of it is I write pieces every now and again, but a big part of it is about community and being able to speak about the music that we're performing and speak about the lives of the composers. I feel like I'm a storyteller as well, so that I can, really welcome people into this world of classical music and help them understand about the lives of these composers and what they faced, that they're not just these figures from the past that don't mean anything. Like, let's get inside their lives and let's figure out the circumstances that they had to deal with in writing this piece you're about to hear. And bring it to life. So that's really fun for me. I love it. And I get to go out to, libraries and schools and all sorts of things. And then we have programs in the hall that we can bring people into, and then have programs for emerging composers. And I get to do a lot of interviews, like interviewing people like you too. So it's a really great thing. But again, this is something that isn't really taught in school, but in reality, these programs with organizations like these residence programs get us out and talking what we do, which is, I think,
the
very
other
important.
thing that, no, absolutely. The other thing I really like about it, and I think it's with what you said, is that you don't have to be an expert to get it. Like for as a listener, I mean, and I think to me, it's like anybody can be a writer. You just have to write and listen to writing. As similarly as you can, as a reader, you can get it. Okay, sure. There's experts who can get who know about things that you maybe don't know about or can analyze in certain ways, like classical music. But anybody can listen to something. You just have a few pointers, and you don't need to be an expert. You can do it. And I feel that that's one of the things to me is like everybody has an imagination, and if it's about trusting your own imagination as a listener, a reader, and as a creator, just to trust that you have everything you need. You just need to trust it, and and it's helpful. Some guidelines from somebody, say like you, who has more experience doing that. I think.
And it's interesting you note imagination. I find that people are much more likely to come to me saying, I heard this in your piece, or I imagined this was happening in your piece, but they wouldn't do that about Mozart, right? That is just completely off limits. But there's something about a contemporary language, a language of today, so to speak, that is perhaps a bit more accessible in a way that they can say, I have a right to imagine.
Yeah, and I guess I feel like Mozart is fixed in stone or something. It's like saying, yeah, I read the Bible and I found some really funny parts. Like, no, you can't say that. Like, no. but there are parts you could find. I mean, there are so like, but like Mozart, a bit like those things that feel that they're so canonical that you can't engage. That feels like you really need to be an expert, and they're fixed. But I think that as with live performances, they're remade every time in that context. I think. So I understand with contemporary music, because it's like, well, it's of our time. So I'm a person of our time. I can engage. Oh, we're being on the subject of our time. I think, yeah.
Well, actually, I think I have one last question for you, and then I'll hand it over. How did you find yourself becoming a writer?
I always made up stories and was interested in language and playing with writing. And I honestly just kept doing it since I was a kid. I just didn't want to give it up. It was so same, and very much after that, like the same thing with music. There's stuff it's like, no, you're supposed to give it up and become an accountant or something. But I never wanted to. I just was so inspired and excited. I wanted to continue just doing it. And so I just did. I just never stopped, and then found ways of sharing it. So I also want to say also, I want to thank you really very much for and also I feel, I regret that I didn't get to ask you questions about all of the like cool and interesting things that you do and have to say. So I really
another time. This one is all about you and Yiddish for Pirates and our wonderful literary series concert, which is so much fun and such a journey within itself. So I look forward to seeing that next week. Thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, thanks so much.
Thank you both. I just had one question also from one of our viewers that came in the Q&A. So I just wanted to quickly ask that. And I think you answered part of it in your dialogue together earlier, but there's a second part I think you might be able to maybe elaborate on. So the question is, Gary, did you grow up speaking English and Yiddish, or was one of them learned later? And how easily did the two mesh as you write a story such as this?
Oh, that's a great question. No, I grew up speaking just English and just hearing like family using Yiddish words, like in little words. However, there's that lovely thing that you often hear people, you often hear it when people are speaking a different language, and then every now and then an English word pops in. There's that beautiful extra spice, that extra sound. So I was doing the opposite, English, then mixing in Yiddish, and it really fit in. We end up using a lot of Yiddish anyway in English and in North America, because it's come to us from movies and comedians. Like, what a schmuck, I can't believe it, I'm verklempt. It was like, like all of that stuff. So it really felt, but it also it's a kind of Germanic language, like a lot of the Anglo-Saxon part of English. And so it really fit in musically well with it. So it's delightful to have that extra energy, but by mixing in another language. And then, so every sentence I could work with it. So it was a really cool opportunity to like make the language come alive for me, the English as well as the Yiddish in it.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to thank you both for taking the time to do this interview this evening. I think it sets up our viewers well for next week's unique concert experience. And as we mentioned, that'll be broadcast online. So we just ask that you register for the event if you haven't done so already, and we will share that link as well. So it'll feature Gary reading from his novel, Yiddish for Pirates, and he'll be accompanied with music from the HPO String Quartet. It'll be captivating performance you won't want to miss. And I certainly, after hearing this discussion, I'm looking forward to seeing it. So if you're unable to join us next week, not to worry, we will share a link of the performance with those who have registered, which will be available to view on demand until November 30th. And we'll also send a follow-up email with the recording of the link within a few days following the November 23rd broadcast. Just looking forward to our next event this week. It's an exploration event. It's taking place tomorrow evening and will feature McMaster alumna and winner of Survivor 42, Marianne O'Ketch. So if you haven't done so and are interested, please register for that. And I'll also in that email share a link to the rest of our exploration series of events, including the one next week with Gary and the HPO. So a final reminder to watch for a pop-up survey immediately following this evening's webinar. We hope you take a couple minutes to fill it out. Once again, thank you both for joining us this evening. It was a great chat and really looking forward to next week's performance. So we hope you'll all join us this time next week for part 2. Enjoy your evening.